Colin mentions field goal factors. I suppose the field goal factor in Ireland over the course of the last 3 to 4 weeks is the Pittsburgh Steelers, and obviously with the recent announcement, and we're going to touch on the Steelers now. And I recorded a podcast the week of the announcement with the Locked On Steelers podcast, and they suggested this Steelers team could have been 13 games this season. I then recorded another podcast with a Steelers person when we discussed last season, and he says I could see a scenario where they only win 5 games this season. So there is very much a mixed opinion on the Steelers team, and I think it all ultimately comes down to the progression of Kenny Pickett in the second season, maybe a season and a half, because again he only kind of came in midpoint of the season. But the Mike Tomlin effect again kind of got them to that winning record. And I was looking at the free agency acquisitions. I mean, they're all serviceable players. There's nothing standout marquee, but it makes sense when you look at the holes in which they need to fill. But where are you on the Steelers team? Are we in a situation where they could surprise people, or is it kind of a case of they'll win, they'll be in games, maybe similar to the Browns, very competitive, will win some, but you can see a scenario where they lose quite a few as well.
I'd be more surprised if they ended up only winning 5 games, to be honest. Like, I don't think it's a surprise if the Steelers end up really contending for the division. I mean, I think on paper and from what we know now of the players as we view them at this stage, they look to have the worst squad, the worst roster in that division. But that doesn't mean anything when you got Mike Tomlin as your head coach, when you have the culture that they have. Like, this is a team that has not finished bottom of their division in 34 seasons. It's the longest streak in the NFL. You know, as we all know, Mike Tomlin legendarily has never had a losing season. If he was ever going to have an excuse to have a losing season, it would have been last year. They still managed to come out 9-8. And key to their success, you know, apart from Tomlin being a brilliant coach and you know, being a brilliant man manager and being Mr. Quotable Quote, like, he just has it all as far as head coaching is concerned. You know, you talk about serviceable, and you know, you go through the roster and you find yourself kind of damning them with faint praise. Well, that guy's good enough, and that guy's decent, and I suppose that guy's okay. But isn't that what they've always done? Like, they don't really necessarily make splashy free agent moves. You don't always look at their draft picks and go, oh yeah, that guy's going to light it up. And yet, you know, you turn around in 1 or 2 years' time, and yet they've developed yet another good wide receiver. They've developed yet another really good defensive back, and they just know how to develop players, how to coach them, and how to bring them on. Like, you know, if you bring in a superstar free agent and he plays well under you, that's not necessarily great coaching, is it? If you're getting the absolute most out of the roster you have, and you know, we talk about the Ravens, who are probably a similar franchise in terms of how they approach things in that sense. That's what the Steelers excel at. You know, you expect them to get the best out of the potential that they've got, and there is room for upside there. There's room for upside with Kenny Pickett. I'm not sure how high his ceiling is, but I think his floor is at a reasonably decent level. We're really excited by what we saw from Pickens last year. You know, they have weapons. You know, they don't look like they're particularly the strongest arsenal when you look at what's around them in that division, but defensively, you think they're going to be in pretty good shape again. You know, they're going to mix it up. As Colin said, like, that, those divisional games are just so unpredictable. They absolutely hate each other. It's set up in such a nice way, even geographically, and you kind of forget that Pittsburgh is right next door to Cleveland, and then, you know, you got the 2 Ohio teams duking it out, and then, you know, the history that they all have with Baltimore. Like, all of those games are pretty much a toss up. So that's how much of your schedule right there is completely unpredictable. Would you be surprised if the Steelers finish winning 11 or 12 games? I don't think so. Do you really think the Steelers are going to be worse than the 9-8 they were last season? I don't think so. I think they get a little bit further along, and it depends whether they come out the right side of those 50-50s, and you'd be very brave to start calling those divisional matchups as you rightly outlined. Even the Browns got one over on the Bengals last year, which didn't seem on the cards, but it's just it's the intensity of those divisional rivalries really add spice and make it difficult to call.
God, in week 1 last year, the intensity was so much. I think we saw 5 missed field goals in that Bengals Steelers game before the Steelers finally won it. But Kenny Pickett had some difficult games, in particular with in terms of the offensive line in front of him. And there was kind of when you looked at the mock drafts leading up to the draft, and where there was various different players going to different teams, the one thing that was locked in was the Steelers were going to go offensive line, and they moved up with the Patriots to take Project Jones. I mean, they recognized they need to kind of protect this guy and give him a fair opportunity. One of the great moments last year, I felt, was Mike Tomlin on Sunday Night Football, where he lost to the Dolphins, and the audio was left on. He said, look, there's better days ahead. don't worry too much. It's significant when you have a head coach of this nature and how great he is, that they can take players and essentially get the most out of them, as Connor's referred to, and get themselves in a position come week 18 that they could have nearly made the playoffs. And is that the level of expectation you would have, that they'll be scrambling for the playoffs and trying to keep up with the two teams ahead of them? Because you feel like it's going to be a fist fight between the Ravens and the Bengals. And as much as the intensity of these games are in the division, ultimately come the end of the season, those two teams still have the players above them to be up there going into the playoffs.
On paper, but I had I know you talked to a few Steelers people, but I got the good fortune to talk to Jarrett Bailey, who I describe him as wildly entertaining, and he's wildly entertaining on Twitter, and he's wildly entertaining on a podcast, and we do a really good chat. And he's a Steelers fan, but I wouldn't say he's a homer. But he did point out, right, that in 2019, Roethlisberger goes down, right, and Mike Tomlin ended up 8-8 with Duck Hodges and Mason Rudolph. And they still ended up 8-8. Now, Kenny Pickett is a better quarterback than either of those, and I think they have better weapons than they did in that season. Will it be a scrap? Absolutely. But I think the other thing to factor into it, Brian, is the fact that I mentioned the winners. Like, teams don't win this division 3 times in a row. Like, you've got to go back to the Steelers teams of the 90s, right? They win it like 4 in a row from 94 up through the 97 season. But ultimately, since then, that hasn't been the case. And the Bengals have won 2 in a row, but that's going to be a scrap to win 3. The Ravens won 2 in a row, 18-19, and then the Steelers won it in 2020. So I don't think anything in this division is a foregone conclusion. And I think that is the power of Mike Tomlin, because he can work magic. And so we know as well that they take training camp much more seriously. This is not the Nathaniel Hackett approach of softly. Like, they hit hard, and they have surprised teams at times when, especially on week 1. They don't always win week 1, but they've won much more than they have lost under Tomlin, and on week 1 especially. So the 49ers are going to be in for a surprise, and whoever ends up starting there is going to be in for a tough game. So to me, I just think you look at the Steelers and you go, yeah, everything points to them absolutely it being a battle, and everything points to the Bengals probably being favorites, but the Ravens would agree with that. And I think the Steelers will look at it and go, there should be no reason why we aren't at least 9-8. And, that's us saying it from the outside. I guarantee you Mike Tomlin is looking at it going, why can't we win 13, 14 games, And I'm sure, publicly they'll say, Shelby Harris famously said to me at one point, we're 17-0 until somebody proves otherwise, and the Broncos won 5 games. But, that's the way teams approach it. That's the way head coaches approach it. But I don't look at it and go, yeah, they're definitely finishing bottom of the division, or they're definitely only winning 5 games, just because the coaching is so good. Now, it's a division where Harbaugh is equally a very, very accomplished coach, but Tomlin has had worse weapons and been in worse situations. I think it's difficult for me to look at it and say that they win it, but it's equally difficult for me to think that they don't win 9 games.
Very good point around how they prepare and start the season. 2 years ago, opening weekend on the road in Buffalo, win that game. Last year on the road in Cincinnati, win that game. Week 1 this year against the 49ers, this time around at home. It'd be interesting to see the fast start that a lot of people will expect. And I suppose this will bring us to the powerhouses, should I say, in this division, because